Hi, folks. Thank you so much for taking the time and energy to join us for this WRDA, or Water Resources Development Act 101 webinar hosted by the Mississippi River Network. MRN is thrilled to have Melissa Samet from the National Wildlife Federation and Olivia Dorothy from American Rivers here as our presenters today. Both representing MRN organizations and very engaged individuals in our space. So we are thrilled to have them with us today. My name is Maisa Khan. I am the policy director at the Mississippi River Network. I am joined on the webinar by our entire tiny but mighty four-person staff team: Kelly McGinnis, Michael Anderson, Gretchen Hagel, and myself. Together, we are the staff behind the Mississippi River Network, which is a coalition of nearly 70 organizations and businesses all working together to protect the people, land, water, and wildlife of our greatest river, the Mississippi. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so I thought I'd throw up a couple thousand words to add some color to this question. Who is the Mississippi River Network? Well, all of this is the Mississippi River Network. Our members include state-based policy advocacy organizations like Friends of the Mississippi River in Minnesota, Healthy Gulf and Louisiana Bucket Brigade down in New Orleans. We also have artists, authors, and outdoor outfitters like the Quapaw Canoe Company in Mississippi. And we like to get out on the river ourselves when we're not busy doing policy work. So these are all some pictures of us gathered at our annual meetings, gathered at our DC fly-ins to connect with our congressional decision makers, and also connecting with each other and our members out on the river. We implement the only national public program of its kind for the Mississippi River called the One Mississippi Program, which is designed to educate, engage, and inspire people to take actions for the river. Our One Mississippi program has recruited over 20,000 river citizens and inspired thousands of actions. I suspect many of you are already part of our river citizen community. So thank you for already being part of that community and showing up at this event to be even more engaged on our policy work. So that grassroots community is supported by our policy program. MRN's policy goal is to advance federal and state policies that promote just, equitable, and resilient communities in 3 ways. And the first way is protecting and restoring ecosystem form and function. The second is reducing the impacts of agricultural and urban runoff pollution. And the third is defending bedrock environmental legislation. And we will learn today from Melissa and Olivia just how connected this specific piece of legislation is to many of our policy goals. We do our policy work in collaboration with many of our MRN members, but I just wanted to highlight 12 here. These are the voting members of our policy committee. Our co-chairs are from the Iowa Environmental Council and the Water Collaborative. But you see here, both American Rivers, Olivia's organization, and NWF are represented in our policy committee. So together, we make this impact and speak up on behalf of the river. So we're here in a webinar on Zoom. I think we're all digital Zoom natives by now, but just a couple of housekeeping items. We are in a normal Zoom meeting mode. That's so we can see each other and see who all is here. So we're all in the same Zoom. Please keep yourself muted so we can hear our presenters throughout their presentations. If you have questions, please put them in the chat at any time, although we will have Q&A at the end of Olivia and Melissa's presentations. Although if we don't get time to answer all of your questions, I will make sure we get some answers together and send them out to everyone who is registered. We are recording this webinar. I will send the link out to everybody who is registered. So if you have a colleague who's tied up in another meeting, they will get the link. The recording will also be posted on our One Mississippi YouTube channel. So if you want to be the first to know, like and subscribe to the One Mississippi YouTube channel. And then of course we will run until the top of the hour, which will include a little bit of Q&A time for both Melissa and Olivia. And that brings me to our two brilliant speakers. Melissa Samet is the legal director of the Water Resources and Coasts at the National Wildlife Federation. Olivia Dorothy is the director of Mississippi River Restoration for American Rivers. I'm going to let them introduce themselves actually for further. We will get to hear them describe their roles and themselves in their words. So with that, I will turn it over to Olivia.
Hello. My side needs you to just stop. There you go. Now I can share. All right. Welcome everybody. I'm so glad folks could make it today. Melissa and I are going to be talking about the Water Resources Development Act. I'm just going to start out by going over what the Water Resources Development is. Melissa is going to talk a little bit about where we are in the process, and then we're both going to review our national priorities that are going to impact the health of the Mississippi River. So just before we get started, if you're not familiar with American Rivers, we are a national nonprofit river conservation organization. We restore damaged rivers, protect wild rivers, and conserve clean water for people and nature. And of course, my name's Olivia Dorothy. I use she, her pronouns. I am the director of our Mississippi River Restoration Program. I'm also a certified floodplain manager. This is my family here. Fun fact about us is every summer we go on a National Lampoon style family vacation to one of the nation's national parks. And this is us in Yellowstone 2 summers ago. Last summer we did St. Louis Gateway Arch National Park, but I forgot to update this picture with the new family photo. All right, so what is the Water Resources Development Act? We often call this bill WRDA from the acronym, as you can see. So WRDA is, as of recently, biennial legislation, which means Congress is trying to pass a WRDA bill every 2 years. Though unlike bills like the Farm Bill, WRDA is not must-pass legislation. It's not a reauthorization bill, so for the most part, everything that is in each new WRDA is new policy or new programs or authorizing new projects. So we've been on this kick for a while now, but prior to Congress sort of declaring this biennial legislation, we would oftentimes see WRDA bills come up every year to every 10 or 12 years. So that's kind of how often Congress passes it. And I often like to say, we don't know when we'll get a WRDA until we get a WRDA is how we handle it. So WRDA directs mostly the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to conduct studies, construct projects, and do research activities. Sometimes WRDA bills can direct other agencies to take on similar studies, projects, and research. However, the bulk of the bill is really focused on the activities of the Army Corps of Engineers on the waters of the United States. And it's important to remember that WRDA does not appropriate any funding. So every year Congress releases the annual budget. However, the Water Resource Development Act may set things like caps for funding of certain programs. but it itself is not a vehicle that moves money into any of the agencies. So just to kind of go over some of the victories of past Water Resources Development Acts, there is a lot of things that environmentalists have gotten through the Water Resources Development Act process, including the Corps of Engineers authority to do ecosystem restoration came from a WRDA bill in the 1980s. But most recently, looking back at the Water Resources Development Act of 2022, we secured water level management authority for the Army Corps of Engineers to manage the dams on the upper Mississippi and Illinois waterway in a manner that promotes ecosystem, the ecosystem of those rivers. Sometimes in the hydro world, you might hear this called environmental flows. However, on the upper Mississippi River, we're calling it water level management because we have to be different. We also authorized in 2022 the Lower Mississippi River Comprehensive Management Study, which has recently kicked off, as well as with the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet Program, the restoration through that program in 2022, Congress ordered all of that restoration to be carried out at full federal expense, which means that there doesn't have to be any local partner cost share. So those are just some examples of different projects, studies, and funding authorities that can pass through, that has passed through the Water Resources Development Act. So what is the WRDA process? It's very similar to most bills that move through Congress. The first step is that members will submit their project study policy requests to their respective committees. So the House, on the House side, that's the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. On the Senate side, that's the Environment and Public Works Committee. These committees often have deadlines. Sometimes there's a portal where the public can submit ideas, but there's always at least a component where members get to submit ideas. And then all of the ideas go in, and some amount of time later, the committees will release their first drafts, discussion drafts of the WRDA text. And so they will take all of those ideas from members. Some ideas will get incorporated or combined with other members' ideas. If they get something that comes in from multiple members or from something from both sides of the aisle, that's usually definitely going to be included in the text, but not always. And so when this the draft text is released, there's this whole edits and amendment processes. So, you know, stakeholders, members of Congress can look at the text and say, hey, that text is wrong, because sometimes the lawyers that draft these bills don't quite understand what the intent of the request was, and will change language and turn it into something it wasn't supposed to be. So discussions happen, and then once that bill becomes finalized, there's usually some type of a deadline. The bill will go to the floor for floor amendments and voting. Sometimes floor amendments are not allowed on WRDA bills because they're so huge and cumbersome. And then once both the House and the Senate have passed their WRDA bills, the bills will go to conference. And so the Senate and the House, they tend not to coordinate initially on their bills, so they each pass what they want, and then there'll be the House and Senate will create a joint conference committee to work with members and constituents on a piece of compromise legislation. Usually nothing new will go into the bill at that point, so it'll just be pieces of the bills from the two chambers. So if you've got the same bill in both chambers, there's pretty much guaranteed to get that in to the conference, but if it's in only one or the other, it might get dropped, but that depends. And then it will go back to both chambers for a final vote, and then it becomes law. If the president signs it, if the president vetoes it, then it doesn't become. That happened a long time ago. Congress overruled it, but But yeah, so then it gets signed into law. That's not the end of it though. The next step after the bill becomes a law, the agencies have to interpret the law. And so they create something called implementation guidance. And so that is when the agencies take all the pieces of the legislation and they try to interpret it for their agency staff to actually use in the field. This implementation guidance process is open to public comment, so you can submit to the agencies what types of, or you can submit to the agencies how you want these different pieces of legislation to be implemented on the ground. We have had issues, a lot of issues in the past with agencies not necessarily writing implementation guidance that aligns with the intent of Congress. And so when that happens, sometimes you have to go back in the next WRDA and try again. And we actually have one example of that in our priorities that we're going to talk about today. And so next up, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to talk a little bit about where we are in the process.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. My pictures are not nearly as much fun as Olivia's, so I do want to warn you, I don't have a giant cat on the screen. This and from the beginning. Okay. So I'm Melissa Samet. I'm the legal director for water resources and coasts for the National Wildlife Federation. The Federation is the nation's largest advocacy organization, conservation advocacy organization. We have more than 9 million members and supporters across the country. We have a long history, well before I came to National Wildlife Federation, of working on the Water Resources Development Act and the precursor bills to that, I believe as well. And we work both on the policy side and on the project side, so trying to get better projects enacted and authorized, and then getting policies enacted and authorized. And we work very hard to also get those properly implemented. I have been dealing with WRDA bill since before 2007, in the lead up to that, where with the help and support and push of many of the groups, I think who are on this call, certainly many groups who are MRN members, we were able to get some pretty significant reforms after a 10-year hiatus. As Olivia said, most recently, Congress has been quite intent on having the bill pass every 2 years. And just to give you a sense of what that means, because it does authorize projects and policies, just recognize that the Corps has well over $100 billion backlog of projects in its bailiwick to do, and so there is a ton of work. So where are we now? And apologies because I just moved my slide and I'm not so good on moving them back, so I'll just leave it up here. Where we're at now, over the past 6 months, both the Senate and the House have had hearings on what should be included in this WRDA bill. They've had non-federal stakeholder hearings. The Corps representatives have come in and talked to members of Congress in hearings. And then on the House side, there was a member hearing. So what the members want to see in their WRDA bill coming up. Members of the Senate have submitted their project and policy proposals to the Senate committee that works on core issues, and that's the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, which many of you I think know. The submittal goes through what's called the WRDA portal. If any of you hear that acronym language thrown around, that's what they're talking about. It's just a way that they can submit their requests electronically. So we understand that on the Senate side, there are at least 1,000 submittals. Hopefully some of those overlap, and hopefully those a number of those include the priorities that our groups have been asking for. So the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee is in the process right now of pulling together their initial WRDA bill, and they plan to mark up that bill in committee in April or May. That can definitely slip. So during the markup, members of the committee can ask for amendments, edits, modifications, deletions to the bill. But a lot of the work on what gets in the bill is actually done behind the scenes with committee staff. On the House side, The House typically starts their WRDA process later, and they follow the Senate, and this year is no different. Members of the House actually have until tomorrow to submit their project and policy proposals through the WRDA portal. Then the committee will be baking that bill as well. And the House committee is the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. So that's who handles the core stuff for the House. They'll eventually be putting their bill together and there'll be a markup. Once that all happens, of course, the next step will be the Senate has to vote on their bill, the House votes on their bill. It goes into conference. On WRDA, the conference process can be pretty intensive. A lot of changes can be made. And the committee staff has a lot of control at that point over what's in and what's out, what the actual language looks like. And what that language looks like is just so critical for this bill, because that even if the intent is one place, if the language is off, it can create real problems for implementing things down the road. And so, one of our reforms I'm going to talk to you about in a second actually is dealing with that. So I'll just say one other thing is that WRDA has historically been a very bipartisan bill, passes with overwhelming support. And I will say historically and very recently, the last series when they've been by every 2 years, that's happened even in election years. So if the bill makes it through the process and gets to the floor, no matter how contentious things may be in Congress, it's very likely that it would get passed this year. So making sure that what you have in the bill is what you want and that the language is right is very, very important. I'll also just add, even though the initial request for the WRDA bills, policies and projects have been submitted, or in the House side will have been submitted by tomorrow, there is a significant opportunity to still influence this bill. So please, for those of you who want to engage, be on the lookout for sign-on letter opportunities, for calls to meet with your members of Congress, either in DC or in district, or their staff, to write letters to the editor, op-eds, anything that you think might be helpful to advance a particular provision that is could be incredibly helpful for the Mississippi River and wetlands and rivers across the country. So now I just wanted to highlight the National Wildlife Federation's primary policy objectives. Again, we have different project-related issues that we deal with, but we have 5 major policy reforms. And just leading into that very quickly, we were told very clearly by both committees that they wanted this to be a policy light WRDA bill. Not sure that happens. We hear that often and repeatedly. So it doesn't always happen that way, but we were told that given where Congress is and the divisions in Congress right now, that, the chances of getting like really broad and significant massive changes to the way the Corps of Engineers operates or plans projects is probably unlikely. So our agenda, our reforms have been developed in that way, recognizing that we are trying to get the most bang for the buck in a way that is not overly grandiose. And so when you hear me talk about these, I just wanted to put that in context. So our first reform is incredibly relevant to the Mississippi River. Right now, and historically, the Corps is not mitigating for the adverse impacts to what it does to operate and maintain the Mississippi River navigation system. So it's not mitigating mandatory mitigation for dredging, for water level management, for the pooling of the water behind the locks and dams, for putting revetment along the river's banks, for building these massive structures in the river training structures. That's what you're looking at a picture of right now, thanks to Olivia, that drive the channel into a deeper and narrower space and deeper, narrower channel. And these activities, as I'm sure you're all aware, have really significant impacts for the health of the river system. And even though Congress has told the Corps and is directing like up and down the river, billions of dollars really of restoration funding, the Corps is leaving these benefits of mitigating the adverse impacts of operations on the table. So we are attempting to get Congress to make sure that the Corps actually does mitigation for operations and maintenance of these long-standing projects. We attempted to address this. We thought we had addressed this particular problem in WRDA 2007, again, with the help of many groups on this call, where we enacted a key provision on mitigation that would require the Corps to actually mitigate these types of impacts. The Corps has created its own loophole in this process, unfortunately, and so it is not doing that for these projects right now. This really goes to these long-standing projects that are very large, projects that were authorized a very long, long time ago. So you're looking here at river training structures on the Middle Mississippi River. That bill that lets the Corps do that was originally authorized in 1888, somewhere way back there. So, the Corps is not mitigating. And so our proposal for a reform here, we have actually two variations. We have one that is focused exclusively on the Mississippi River navigation system that would direct the Corps to develop mitigation plans and then implement that mitigation. We also have a more nationally focused fix to close this loophole across the country, because this is happening all across the country. And again, the impacts are quite significant. So that is our first reform. We have lots of detailed language, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot more out there if anybody has any questions. Our second reform, also thanks to a lovely picture from Olivia, is an attempt to improve the Corps' modeling, how it models hydrologic changes to the river and to rivers across the country, how it models and assesses climate change impacts, including sea level rise, how it actually implements the models that it does have. The Corps has historically a real big problem with its modeling. It often is using very outdated models. Its sea level rise data is actually based on sea level rise projections that were created in 1987 in a codified, marked up in a document that was actually dated 2013. So very, very long ago and outdated. And many communities are like, we don't want to use that. We don't want to use your sea level rise projections. We want real accurate, up-to-date sea level rise projections. What you're looking at here is a tabletop micro model that the Corps has been using to try to determine what the impacts are of those massive river training structures that you just saw a picture of a second ago. Right? Clearly, this cannot tell you anything. These are not predictive in any way, shape, or form. And the Corps is just now starting to phase away from using this on the Middle Mississippi River after many, many years of us all complaining and trying to sue the Corps to get that to change. So we have a proposal, again, for modeling, because if your models are wrong, you don't know if the project's effective, you don't know how much damage it's going to cause, you don't know who's going to get that water dumped on them if you're building a levee. We have two provisions. One deals with clearly telling the Corps that they have the authority and the direction to go and work with other federal agencies with more robust modeling, to work with national academies and academic institutions to develop, update, modify the Corps' hydrologic models, to use the models from other entities if they make sense. So that's one piece of it. And the other piece is to really build in some more robust outside independent review of actual models, so the data that goes into them, how the Corps runs them, because we've seen massive problems in that space as well, where the Corps says, oh, the river's, a mile wider than it is, and, 20 miles longer than it is, less water in it, and it just makes it so that the agency has no idea, and that model is not predictive. So the Corps has no idea what the actual impacts will be. So those are the two pieces of our modeling provision. Let's see here. Our third proposal also deals with a provision that was originally enacted in the Water Resources Development Act of 2007. This was actually a big floor vote amendment on the Senate floor. It was all my first foray into that universe. It was quite exciting, and we won, and it was great. But we needed it because the Corps had a very long history of poor planning and having real problems in their environmental impact statements and the studies that they use to look at how they should plan projects. Historically, and that provision actually had a sunset provision in it, so that the independent external peer review process would just go away. And the concept originally from Congress was, well, the Corps would actually not need to have this anymore because these independent peer reviews would filter into the Corps' DNA, and then they would be doing better jobs down the road. What we're finding is that the agency still has some problems with its studies and project planning processes. And the independent external peer review process, while not perfect, is actually finding a lot of problems with studies. And they send those recommendations to the Corps, and the Corps is adopting many of them. So we have seen studies where, very recent ones, where the Corps has adopted 54 panel recommendations or 45 panel recommendations, et cetera. And some of those recommendations some of them are for, how you present data so the public understands it. But other of those are things like, well, you need to have more drains in the floodway or in the spillway of your dam, because otherwise when you have the floodway being used on that dam, it could collapse. So some of these are very, very significant for public safety, and others are much more for making sure the public can understand what the Corps is saying. So we are attempting to have the sunset. This provision actually ends this year unless the sunset is extended. We're trying to get that sunset lifted so this becomes permanent and we don't have to deal with this over and over again each time a word comes out. And we also want to make sure that the independent reviewers can look at and account for and consider planning requirements that have come into place since this provision originally was enacted in 2007. And most notably that the Corps is properly evaluating natural and nature-based solutions. So that's our independent peer review provision. Two more, and these go a little bit more quickly, just for your awareness. So our fourth proposal is to improve planning for natural and nature-based measures. So these are things like restoring wetlands, getting wetland reserve easements, restoring river systems and functions particularly in the Corps of Engineers space. They do this to reduce flood impacts and to minimize the damage from other projects. That's in addition, of course, to oh, sorry, my screen disappeared on me, guys. So let me do this. That's, of course, in addition to this type of work that they're doing for restoration. So this is a little bit separate from the restoration context, but actually using restoration techniques to reduce flood damages and to make existing projects like levees more resilient. So if you have a wetland buffer in front of your levee, it's going to be more resilient to climate change impacts, just to riverine flooding, et cetera, like that. Congress over the years, and particularly during the last few WRDAs, has, beginning in 2018, has really directed the Corps multiple times to use natural and nature-based measures. But what we're seeing is that the agency still has these institutional barriers to understanding what it is, considering what it all means, and then to actually recommending these types of solutions. And we're trying to help overcome those institutional barriers. So the first one, what we often hear is the Corps say things like, well, we don't do that. We don't do wetland reserve easements. That's what USDA does. So we have a provision that would give the Corps the authority to transfer funds to another agency to do the implementation component of that piece. So if the Corps says we need 20,000 acres of wetland reserve easements in this area to reduce flood impacts, then they could pass through project-specific funding to USDA to do the easements, and USDA has a lot more easement requests than they can possibly fulfill. So it's kind of like that proverbial win-win for everybody. So that's one piece of our proposal. Another piece of our proposal is to, and this should just be happening anyway, but in many cases it's not, to make sure the Corps is actually mapping the natural infrastructure that already exists in a project area. So to see how the project will impact that and where you could get the most bang for your buck for building out from that. So where do the wetland reserve easements currently reside in the project area? Where are there national wildlife refuges? Where are there national forest lands? Where are there existing core mitigation lands? So all of that mapping component. And our last provision is that I can go over very quickly, and it's really talking about trying to address the need to improve public safety and improve flood resilience and pre-disaster mitigation planning. And we simply are asking that Congress direct the Corps to include information on repetitive levee failures in the already existing national levee database. Olivia can talk a lot about this database. She's quite familiar with it and has been advocating for that for quite a while. But right now, the one thing that the Corps isn't tracking are when levees fail, how much it costs to build it, to repair it, who got flooded, what year that happened. And that's really important. It's important for communities to know if they're at risk behind a levee that's failed a couple times. And it also lets the community pre-plan to address the problems that are there. If a levee fails multiple times, there's a problem with the levee, either where it's located or how it's built. And so knowing where that happens is really, really important, being able to track that for pre-planning. And so those are our 5 primary reforms. And of course, happy to answer any questions at that time. And I'm going to turn it back over now to stop sharing here and turn it back over to Olivia. So thanks everybody so much for listening.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our primary proposals that we have at American Rivers for the Water Resources Development Act. Go forward. There we go. So our first priority is to improve the Army Corps' disposition study process. So dispositions are a process whereby the Corps of Engineers is able to review water resources infrastructure and dispose of those structures if they are found to be no longer of service for their authorized use. Or they could potentially put in a request to Congress to change the authorized use if that infrastructure has some new value to the public. We actually amended this legislation in the WRDA 2022. However, we discovered that there needs to be some additional reforms to the language. The disposition study process was initially authorized in the Flood Control Act of 1964, 54, something like that. And it has been very little used until recently. And so there's been some renewed attention on trying to build out this process to make sure that the Corps of Engineers really has the authority to remove structures that they built. So basically, the Corps of Engineers has built a lot of water resource infrastructure throughout the nation, and a lot of it has been abandoned or is no longer functional or little used. And so there is a need to establish a clear sort of path for the Army Corps to take their infrastructure out of commission and actually remove it for environmental improvements. Part of these reforms that we're asking for specifies that the Corps must evaluate the environmental impact of leaving structures in place. And so a lot of environmental impact statements that we see today don't actually evaluate what the impacts are of leaving something alone, if leaving a dam in a river. And so this, hopefully if this passes, we may be able to see the Corps actually start to evaluate the full impacts of their infrastructure in this decision-making process. We definitely need a clearer authority, like I said, for the Corps to remove their own obsolete infrastructure. There's a lot of resistance within the Corps to doing this. And so we need to make that pathway a lot clearer through WRDA. And our proposal also clarifies that if the Corps built a structure, but that non-federal sponsor has been dissolved or no longer exists or can't be identified, that structure does fall back, that responsibility of that structure does in fact fall back on the Corps of Engineers to make it eligible for disposition and removal. We have a lot of infrastructure that the Corps built, and we don't know who owns it. And that creates a very significant barrier for any type of environmental modifications or removal. Our second priority is to reauthorize the dam safety program. This is an example of a program that actually falls under the Emergency Management Agency, not the Corps of Engineers. The dam safety program really supports the state dam safety programs, which include things like training, staff salaries, planning, support, inspection report, monitoring support. And all of this helps keep communities safe from dam failures. We need to make sure that dams don't fail and flood downstream communities unexpectedly, especially in the face of climate change. This program also has a grant program called the High Hazard Potential Dam Rehabilitation Grant Program that funds rehabilitation or removal of some of the nation's most dangerous dams. So this is a big program to protect public safety. I'm sure a lot of folks on the phone are familiar with the hazards that dams present. If you are, you can get sucked into dams, over dams, and then trapped underneath dams. And so this is a program that really helps us get rid of dams that aren't necessary anymore and keep people safe. We have another, I think this is our third proposal to amend the Lowhead Dam inventory. This is an example of a bill that the Water Resources Development Act of 22, where we were able to specify in that act that the Corps of Engineers had to keep an inventory of lowhead dams. However, the language, according to the Corps of Engineers, the language did not specify that they could then include that data in the National Inventory of Dams, which is a public online database that you can go into and find information about your dams. So we managed to get a bill passed that we thought would end in the Corps including that information in their public-facing inventory. The Corps said that even though they would collect it, they wouldn't include it. So now we have to go back to Congress and get that clarified. And so just so you guys know, lowhead dams, these are dams with a drop of 6 inches to 25 feet. These could include things that might be things like stream crossings, and not necessarily what you would think of as a traditional dam, although they certainly include those too. This program also has a funding aspect to it that can help finance different types of dam, lowhead dam safety type projects, monitoring, and data collection within each of the states. And we also want to amend the National Levee Safety Program to really incorporate, I know Melissa was talking about some of this, about tracking levees that have failed. We are, of course, supportive of NWF's proposal. But in addition to that, we want to incorporate the protection and restoration of natural floodplains in the disaster management framework. So a lot of our floodplain development decisions are made by local municipalities in the context of disaster management. And so with this amendment, we would make more information available to those communities through the floodplain mapping process so that local municipalities can understand and apply all the ecosystem service benefits that come from natural functioning floodplains, and so that they can make better decisions for their communities. And then we have our last priority is the Integrated Floodplain Management Pilot Program. This is a pilot program that would leverage collaborations to reduce flood damages and provide environmental benefits for flood-prone communities. 70% of floodplains across the country are in poor condition, and integrated floodplain management recognizes that floodplains have multiple uses and multiple benefits that can coexist for ecosystem function as well as sustainable human use. This pilot program would bring successful programs that are currently based in Washington, Vermont, and California to the national stage and create sort of a mere federal program that these states currently have in place that have been extremely successful and popular. And that is the end of my presentation. And so I am happy to take questions, and I know Melissa will come off mute too as well.
Fabulous. As my friends and I like to say, we have our face in the honey at MRN with the brilliance of people like Olivia and Melissa and their organizations. And I will just say that one of MRN's grassroots priorities for 2014 are very focused on WRDA. And, you know, you heard the extensive proposals that NWF and American Rivers are working on. At MRN, we're supporting NWF and American Rivers' proposals, especially the ones, I think our focus is on those ones that make it more cost effective for the Corps to do those nature-based projects, as well as address the impacts that they've already had on the Mississippi River due to navigation. So as a grassroots priority, you know, MRN really sees, as kind of building off of what Melissa said, we always have an opportunity to talk about the river, but given that our Congress people are thinking about the next WRDA, this is a great time to just elevate some of these concerns. So we will be doing that through our DC fly-in in March. I know there are a couple of other organizations and coalitions who will be there in March as well. So WRDA will be on our on our song sheet, as well as just finding ways for our grassroots supporters, our river citizens to engage. So you will see that in various different ways throughout the year from MRN. And actually, as I get my question together, I'm going to take my host prerogative and ask 2 questions to Olivia and Melissa first, but I neglected to launch a poll just to know a little bit more about you all who are here in the room. So if it is appearing for you, if you would answer just we want to know more about you all and your interest here in this webinar. So if you could pick what describes your interest or your profession. But as I let that poll roll, so Olivia and Melissa, my first question, which was actually from a member of ours, can you talk more about so you talked about policy proposals, but WRDA also includes all those specific projects that are authorized. What's the process for a project to be authorized, and where does one find authorized existing projects? So that's project question. And then the second, bigger picture, could you talk about the 7 or 8 authorized purposes of the Corps and how that does or doesn't interact with maybe some of the questions that are being asked about why they do or don't things, how they prioritize their mission, basically, as they're doing their work.
Olivia, you want to go or you want me to?
You can go.
You go. All right. So the Corps' project development process can be pretty convoluted, complex, and long. So on the project side, typically there are 2 ways it can happen. Members of the public can submit a request for project studies through their 7001 process, and there are a bunch of requirements that you have to, you know, co-sponsors, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you have to submit into this 7001 portal for studies. Members of Congress can also ask for specific studies. So as the core process works is they authorize a project study to study what the agency should do. Then they authorize a project if the Corps recommends one. So the study process comes first. Once the study's done, the chief of engineers has a chief of engineers report. Those get submitted to Congress. They authorize what the Corps is recommending for a particular project, and that's what then those projects get authorized specifically and individually through the WRDA process. Olivia can talk some more about the Corps' missions, but they do have three primary mission areas: navigation, flood damage reduction, flood and hurricane storm damage reduction, and ecosystem restoration. They have a bunch of recreational stuff that they do. They do other things. They do some water supply. They have a bunch of smaller ones. Those three primary mission areas are supposed to be driving the agency. I would just say that they do tend to prioritize from my history with the agency, navigation over a whole bunch of other stuff, especially along the Mississippi River. So if there's a navigation piece, that's what they're going to go to first. But Olivia, you want to weigh in on any of that?
Yeah, I'll just say one of the questions that I saw in the chat was sort of why doesn't the Corps do things that Congress directs them to do? I think is the best way to interpret that question. And you know, just building off what Melissa said with the three main mission areas: navigation, flood control or disaster resilience, and ecosystem restoration. In a lot of ways, those mission areas can be in conflict with each other. So a levee is a strategy, a flood control strategy that disconnects rivers from their floodplains, and obviously pumps that go in with the levees drain wetlands as well. So that there is a lot of inherent and institutional conflict between the Corps' mission areas, and that can be very challenging to overcome. To say it nicely, the Corps is supposed to try to balance all of these things. And from an environmentalist perspective, I would definitely say that agree with Melissa that there tends to be a much higher focus on especially the navigation and flood control mission areas. Navigation being the first mission that Congress actually authorized the Corps of Engineers to do. And we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of the Army Corps of Engineers navigation mission in this year, 2024, 200 years ago. Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to dredge and remove snags from the Mississippi and Ohio rivers for navigation. So a little bit of history for you there. Also, I'll add too, I put this in the chat, that sometimes, you know, we talked a little bit about the implementation guidance process and how sometimes the Corps of Engineers will create implementation guidance that does not match the Congress's intent with the legislation. And so that also can create conflicts as well.
Thank you both. Michael, if you launch the poll, it's still not working for us. So,
I see the poll. Am I the only one who sees the poll?
Anyone else see the poll? Oh, okay.
Maybe you guys are the only one who don't see the poll.
Aha.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much. I've answered it twice.
Oh, I'm just
vote
going
row-
to ask, should I answer it again?
Sure.
Okay. Why
Thanks.
not?
I think most of the questions in the chat have been answered, but I see
There's a
one
new
from
one.
Mary Ellen, yeah. Interesting how far the Corps reaches. They control the Lake Rathburn watershed in south central Iowa. Is it related to a stream being labeled navigable? Can those designations be changed?
In the federal definition of navigable really dates back to the days when we were navigating days before roads, basically, when we were getting around by putting canoes and log rafts into rivers to travel across the United States. And so rivers are deemed as navigable if they could potentially float. Basically, it's if it can float a canoe, it's navigable. Melissa, do you want to answer that? That's sort of the rule of thumb.
There's also, I think, yes, that's the rule of thumb, and it's interesting how it gets interpreted down the road, and it has lots of ramifications and implications. I would say keep in mind that there are two sides to the Corps. Well, there are multiple sides to the Corps. There are actually three. There's their military component, and they do military construction. We don't. National Wildlife Federation doesn't deal with that. Other groups may. There's their civil works component, and that's what we've been talking about today. So when they build stuff, they plan stuff, and then they build it, and they can only do what Congress has told them to do. Typically, it's project specific, but they do have these continuing authorities programs that allow them to just go ahead and plan and build smaller scale projects without having to go to Congress. Then there's an other side of the Corps' regulatory program and how it manages and regulates waters of the United States, which is a whole another big issue that the Supreme Court recently threw up into a bit of disarray on what's protected by the Clean Water Act. Those are three different areas and three different streams. I'm not sure which you were referring to with respect to that watershed, but it may, if you wanted to ask more questions, happy to try to answer that. Changing, there's navigable, like for what the Corps does, and then there's navigable as that's being defined for whether or not a river or stream is protected or wetland is protected by the Clean Water Act. So they're two separate things. And I'm not really sure what the question was, but happy to answer more if you want to expound on that.
Great. And in our final minute, my friends from the press and media, is there anything on your mind or anything you were hoping to learn about WRDA that we didn't get to, that we can queue up Melissa and Olivia for? Putting Tegan and Maddie on the spot, basically.
I will just add that Melissa and I are both happy to share fact sheets related to our WRDA proposals. If anyone would like to take a look at those, we're happy also to answer additional questions.
Oh, good, great. Well, with that, we're at the top of the hour. Again, deep gratitude to Melissa and Olivia. What we get to benefit literally from their decades of experience and expertise and engagement with the Corps. So thank you for this hour and all of the other hours that you have spent on various WRDAs and engaging with the Corps. Thank you all for making the time and bringing your energy and participation to this webinar. Stay tuned for our next one, and we'll see you next time. Bye.